Welcome everybody to this afternoon's discussion of memoQ terminology and how to get more out of it. The working title for the talk is Getting on Better Terms with memoQ. I forgot to do a poll for this to find out how many people are currently working with memoQ and what issues you might be encountering. We can discuss some of that in the Q&A at the end. This talk today is sort of a preview of some of the material that's going to be part of the Coming to Terms discussion, which is a workshop in Amsterdam on June 30th of this year. Information on that workshop and how to sign up for it is on my blog, Translation Tribulations. But today I'm going to focus on a little more narrow aspect, specifically some of the things that are up for discussion in June, but only the ones that relate to memoQ, really. The workshop in June will have a very large memoQ component to it, but I'm also going to be talking about some free and open source tools and also going more into collaboration with people who are using other tools. That's really not so much the point of today's discussion, because I also wanted to highlight some of the recent considerable improvements in the way that memoQ handles terminology and what some of this might mean for you and your work. Okay, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Lossner. I've got sort of a long history in translation. I'm a state-examined translator for science in Germany from the Hudson office in Berlin. I'm a sworn translator for the Bavarian courts, which since 2012 actually makes me a sworn translator for all the German courts, and I'm also a certified memoQ trainer. I've been involved in translation in one way or another for more than 40 years now, although for most of that time it was to support my own work in scientific research or personal projects, but the last 18 years I've been a commercial translator. I've also got quite a few years of technology consulting, mostly in IT consulting and chemistry consulting as it relates to materials, medical device materials and other things. I've been a teacher in a number of different environments, university, secondary school, and various professional venues. And I work primarily with English, German, and a little bit of Portuguese. So sometimes the examples that I choose may not be relevant to somebody else's language combination. And I always welcome questions and challenges from other languages like Swahili or Arabic, because there's usually something to learn, and sometimes that even benefits the more ordinary working languages that I thought I had a comprehensive overview of. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, I do a blog called Translation Tribulations. The URL is down at the bottom of this slide. And there you'll find quite a large variety of articles on different technology subjects, including terminology, that have been written over the last 10 years. It's about, the blog is 10 years old now. And occasional political contributions about some of the controversies in our profession. So the question you might ask is, why would you want to use memoQ in particular for working with your terminology? And what advantages does memoQ have, perhaps over some of the other tools that you might be more familiar with? memoQ, for me, and for other users, offers more than just ordinary terminology or glossary handling. And I'll give some examples of what that means in just a minute. memoQ also provides some very nice integrated tools for discovering frequent terminology that you might have in your documents to translate, in your translation memories, and collections of reference texts or corpora that you might have created in live docs. And all of these three different types of sources can be mined separately or in combination to identify terms that are used frequently. And this can have a lot of different applications to one's work, which perhaps we can discuss later. One of the other things I find useful in recent versions of memoQ, that is over the last 5 years or so maybe, is that although it lacks the domain and subject-specific selections that one finds, for example, in Déjà Vu, which I was very, very fond of years ago when it was my primary working tool. It does offer priority settings for Termbases so that you can give priority to a customer's selected terminology or specific collections of terminology that you've made over others that you may be using for reference. And this selection can play out in a number of different ways. One of the other very nice things about memoQ for me is that you can specifically target the term bases in which you collect your terminology. And this is particularly the case since memoQ version 2015, also known as memoQ 7.8, and all the versions afterward, because as of that version, Kilgore introduced a very, very nice feature in their new keyboard settings, which I'll show you a little bit later, that allows you to specifically target up to 9 individual term bases to write your terminology in, as well as whatever term bases you have for default collection. memoQ also offers better possibilities for matching terminology than you will find in many other tools, dealing with irregular nouns or verbs, for example, or dealing, for me, this is a very important thing, dealing with typographical errors, typos in the source text, or OCR errors. You can adjust the settings for your memoQ term bases in a way that make them fault tolerant. And that, since those features were added a number of years ago, that has significantly improved the efficiency with which I'm able to use my collections of terminology. memoQ also allows you to control forbidden terms, terms that perhaps your client doesn't want to see because they're ambiguous, or perhaps they represent preferred terminology of a competitor that they prefer to avoid. This is actually a feature, I think, that started with the French software, WordFast. Yeah, WordFast, years and years ago. In fact, I actually took a WordFast license for a couple of years because I liked that so much. This was back before my memoQ days. And it's extremely helpful, both during translation and during QA. And in fact, that feature is shown in the screenshot on this slide. You see those terminologies for Kartellverstoß that are marked in black. In the term properties, these are marked as forbidden terms because in this particular project, I wanted to select and have only the term cartel infringement for that term in German. memoQ term bases also allow you to collect a lot of other helpful information, such as examples of use. Now, some other terminology tools, for example, SDL multi-term, allow you to do that as well, and to some extent, some of those other tools even do it better. But again, when you consider all of the features that are available for the term bases, I think that on the whole, memoQ really comes out the winner these days. One of the other things that you can include, which I'll show you an example of, are graphics, and the utility of that particular function has improved considerably in recent years. You've been able to put graphics in memoQ term entries for many years, but there were always some difficulties moving that into other environments, and that has been resolved in the most recent version of memoQ. And one of the other things that I like so much about memoQ, and a point that I'm going to emphasize toward the end of this talk, is that by understanding all of the possible settings that you can do related to terminology, and particularly with the properties of the individual term entries, you can improve the quality of you can improve the results of your quality checks. By that I mean get fewer false positives, be able to identify possible errors more effectively, and overall deliver a better translation product in the end. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, I mentioned that memoQ does more than just ordinary terminology. I've mentioned and then showed you the example on the previous slide of how forbidden terms can be identified in the translation results pane. They can also be specifically identified when you run the QA procedure on your translation. There are also a couple of other categories of, well, what I consider to be terminology essentially, that are not specifically described as terminology or that don't have to do with the term basis per se in memoQ, but which essentially relate to the management of terminology in your translation projects. One example of this is a so-called non-translatable term. This would be, for example, a company name which would remain the same whether you're translating into French, into English, into German, into Slovakian, in any language. And memoQ has specific list management features for this type of term, which are available. And so for me, this is just another aspect of terminology management in memoQ. memoQ also has an extremely useful, if sometimes somewhat complicated, facility for dealing with structured expressions. Now, what the heck is that? If you look on the lower right-hand side of this slide, you see a screenshot of the translation results pane from one of my projects. And at the lower part of that list, you see some entries where number 4 and 5 that are marked in green. Okay, as you can see from looking at it, that has one of them, the first one, number 4, is a date expression. And on the left, it shows the abbreviated date format. This is from an EU document. This is the EU standard. And it is being mapped to an English long date. Okay, now this isn't exactly a term, but it's kind of like a term. It follows a certain pattern. And memoQ, using its auto translation rules facility, is able to treat these expressions like dates, or the second one, number 5, is a Portuguese time expression, 21H00. Somebody in California might not know what to do with that. So on the right-hand side, it's being mapped to a more familiar date format for Americans. And I have other rule sets, for example, where that 9 o'clock p.m. might use a large P and a large M, or might put a period after the P and a period after the M. These are all different possibilities that a specific client might want, and you can account for all of these with special structured expression rule sets in memoQ, which is a very, very powerful thing. As far as I know, it's not offered in any other translation environment tool, certainly no translation environment tool with which I'm personally familiar. And that structured expression facility can also be used for things like abbreviations, and I'll show you an example of that shortly. Okay, here's a more specific example of these so-called non-translatables. And on the slide, I have a large red arrow marking the icon for where to find those. For example, in the settings tab of your, excuse me, of your individual project. You can also get to these lists via the resource console if you want to. And in the foreground of that screenshot, you see a dialog that shows the content of this particular non-translatables list. It's possible to have multiple non-translatables lists active in a project, but only the primary one will be written to when you decide to save a new expression as a non-translatable expression. And in this particular screenshot, there's a small problem in the list that I've created here. Most of those expressions would work just fine, and they would be correctly identified by memoQ, unless there's some sort of a typographical error, because non-translatables in memoQ currently match exactly. So even changes in capitalization are going to create a little bit of an issue. So that does give it some does give these lists some limitations for use as terminology. However, that is balanced by the fact that the lists are not language specific. So I can create one non-translatables list with company names, for example, and that can be used in a project with 20 different target languages. So that's very helpful. You have to balance the advantages and the disadvantages in a situation like that. Now, what's the problem here? Is it obvious to anybody? Look at it for a second. Look at the fourth and fifth entries. You see around the B plus V, one case you've got spaces, in the other cases you don't. That's going to be a matching problem. If you have non-translatables like this that are going to have some problems with small typing variations, then you would want to resort to an actual entry in the Termbase for that, which I show here. And here, in an ordinary Termbase entry, by using the fuzzy setting for the matching, this expression, Forum B&V Oil Tools, which is the name of a company, becomes more fault tolerant. And I will get a match and a suggested translation to the correctly formatted name, which is not supposed to have spaces in it. Whether or not there are spaces in the source or not. And in fact, I've even set the case sensitivity to no, which means that if for some reason they type a small O for oil, it'll still give me a match. But on the target side, the case sensitivity is set to yes. So when I do my quality assurance check at the end, if I have miscapitalized that company's name, that mistake will be flagged as an error. The problem with doing this, of course, is that if you have a project with 20 different languages, you're going to have to do this 20 different times, which is kind of a nuisance. But that's life. Okay, one other very, very useful thing that memoQ can do with structured expressions, which are like terminology, is to go with abbreviations. Now, I wrote an article on this about, 15 months ago, I think. I've got the URL for that down at the bottom of this slide. It was an article called Build a Regex Savvy Termbase in memoQ. Well, it's not really a Termbase, it's an auto translation rules set. And here I'm just showing an example of an abbreviation that I encounter all the time as a translator from German. I find this particularly in legal texts, but in other texts as well. It's a small I followed by a period, followed by a capital V, followed by a period, and then a little m, followed by a period if it's typed perfectly. And one possible translation for this is in conjunction with. Well, I notice in the course of my work that people are in a hurry sometimes and their fingers slip and they'll add an extra space in a place that's not expected. And that can have a number of different consequences. And among them being that it's not, you have to build some kind of a recognition rule that's fault tolerant. Well, you might say, well, why can't you just use the Termbase and tell it to use fuzzy matching? Well, a couple reasons you can't. First reason is that memoQ Termbases do not handle punctuation well at all. In fact, if you try to include punctuation, in memoQ term entries, depending on which punctuation you put in, you can completely screw the Termbase up when you try to export it. Commas, for example, play absolute hell with the export file, so that when you try to import that file again into another Termbase, suddenly some of your term entries are garbled, and those ones are inevitably the ones where somebody has put a comma into the term entry. But also, if you have periods, they're just not recognized properly. And that's been a problem for a long time. I've heard some complaints Gilgray at memoQ Fest about this, but it's a technically difficult problem for memoQ developers to deal with. And so the way to deal with that is using the auto translation rules. But as I say, it's a little bit more complicated. And here in the sort of the middle lower part of the slide in blue and green and black, I've got an example of how a rule might look that would represent that expression and might be fault tolerant and still recognize the term, even if spaces are typed in the wrong place or the periods are left out. And over on the left, you can see some examples of variations of this particular abbreviation that I have, honest to God, seen in my projects. And if you are doing work in some specific domain where abbreviations like this occur very frequently in your source language, where they've got periods, if properly written in the abbreviation, which may or may not be there depending on how lazy the lawyer is who typed the document. This is how you can deal with it. And now you might say, oh my God, regular expressions are way too complicated for me and I'm never going to do that. Well, congratulations, you shouldn't. I personally do not believe that individual users should be burdened with trying to master regular expressions as a rule. I have been a programmer myself with, probably more than 30, maybe as many as 40 different programming languages in the course of my life. And in the course of all of that, I have learned and forgotten regular expressions at least a dozen times. It's not easy. It's not easy to remember, especially if you don't do it every day. But one of the things I'm going to talk about in the workshop in Amsterdam, and one of the things that you can read about after this discussion or any other time you feel like, is strategies where you can make use of this kind of facility, but you don't have to learn the regular expressions. And what I've done is I've developed a procedure for documenting the problems, documenting the structured expressions like the dates or the currency expressions, or in this case, the abbreviations that you might encounter in your work, and maybe making some notes about the variations that are possible or that you see in your routine work. And then you give those to a technical expert who can usually take that description and implement it into this scary looking rule or rules like it very quickly and efficiently. And that's a much better use of your time. There's also a number of these sorts of things that are discussed and are available free to use from some of the online memoQ discussions. For example, the Yahoo memoQ discussion group has a lot of this kind of stuff in its archive over the years. But in any case, this is a particular term-related problem that you can solve with memoQ that I don't think is really solvable in a very flexible way with any other tool that I've seen. So this is a unique advantage of memoQ. You don't have to use it, but boy, if you do, can it save you a lot of time and trouble. Okay, another thing that memoQ offers, which may or may not be useful to people, is access to external glossaries via plugins. And in fact, this is sort of a bad thing in some cases because the Euro Term Bank plugin, for example, I think is still activated by default when you install them. Then all sorts of mysterious and wrong terms start showing up in people's translation lists. causing a lot of confusion. So usually the first thing I do in a new memoQ installation is I go and disable that. But there is also the TAAS, or Terminology as a Service plugin, or the plugin for terminologies on WordFast servers, which might in fact be very useful to you if you're working on a project where people are using that kind of thing. TAAS, for example, can be used by technology users with a lot of different platforms, SDL Trados Studio and many others. So these are valid options in projects where you may be collaborating with people who use other technology tools to support their translation work. One other really nice feature of memoQ is the fact that you can use it to access external glossaries on the web. And these can take many different forms. If this is using the memoQ web search feature, I've got the icon for this in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. You find that, for example, in the resource console and also in the settings under the options icon from the memoQ quick access toolbar at the top left. And usually people use this for accessing things like the Leo glossary if you work with German and other languages, or looking up things on Pond's dictionary, or any of the other many terminology servers on various web pages. But I find it very useful to use this with Google Sheets to create terminologies that can be shared with a client or shared with collaborators who may be using other platforms, or even memoQ, where you don't have access to a memoQ server. And this is a very nice feature. I've got several articles on this subject written on my blog talking about how to create custom URL search strings that can let you pick out just the columns and just the hits that you want. And there are some canned examples of this in the articles I've written. The URLs that you see here on this slide, they're short URLs for some public examples I've created with SAP data. And the first link shows you a small selection of SAP terms in more than 30 languages. And this particular example I built years ago to show how one can create a master Termbase in an online spreadsheet. And then the following links below that are specific views of that master sheet, which are optimized for downloading into different CAT tools. And that was, I remember I published that maybe 8 years ago, quite a while ago. But then more recently, we've discovered ways using free APIs for Google that allow you to do specific searches and bring up a list with just the hits that you're looking for from a particular online spreadsheet. So that is worth looking onto, and that's a feature that also enhances the terminology experience with memoQ. It just happens to be a feature which is also available basically to everybody else, whether they use a CAT tool or not. So it's an excellent collaboration interface for memoQ. And this is going to be one of the things that we talk about in detail in the workshop in Amsterdam at the end of June. Okay, and this is just another view this is a view of the main spreadsheet, which is optimized for memoQ in this case. Okay, one of the other very, very nice features about memoQ and working with terminology in memoQ is the ability to discover frequent terms in different sources based on their frequency, right? And here in the screenshot, I'm showing an example of the starting dialog for doing what they typically call a term extraction session, which has the date as its default name. You can change that so it doesn't say Thursday, May 24th. And as I mentioned earlier, you can look at the documents that you've been given to translate as possible term sources. You can also separately or simultaneously look at your translation memories, all of them, or your main TM or specific TMs that you might have selected in the list of translation memories. And you can do the same with collections of documents in LiveDocs Corpora, or you can look at all three of them at once, whatever suits you for your application. And one of the things that's really important when you do this kind of work is to have something called a stopword list. And that's because there are an awful lot of common words that are going to show up with high frequency that we really don't care about as far as important terminology in our translation is concerned. And that would be, for example, prepositions, simple nouns and verbs, and so forth. And so by creating a list of these uninteresting words, okay, and saving that, it's called a stopword list, we can reduce the noise in the frequency analysis of words in our document collections that we're looking at, and focus in more quickly on the important terminology for our work. And here in the screenshot, I've got a red box around the drop-down list where these stopword lists are located. And here, for example, you see that Kilgrey has got a Portuguese stopword list, which was recently introduced. They've got stopword lists for a number of other languages. They're not shown here because this is a project in Portuguese. And you can also create your own list. In this particular case, I have my own custom list for Portuguese. It goes well beyond Kilgrey's default list. And one of the really nice things about the most recent version of memoQ, version 8.4, is Kilgrey has greatly improved the process of adding entries to these lists of unwanted words. So you could, for example, add all of the words you rejected during a term search, and that expands your stopword list. And then the next time you go and look at terms in a collection of documents, you can have even less noise to look at. So there's a lot of value here, but this is a feature which unfortunately is a little bit intimidating to people, and not very many people make use of this. But I find that this is one of the most valuable things that I can do at the beginning of a project. And I think almost every project that I do that has about 10,000 words or more in it, I do an analysis of the frequent terminology before I even take the project on, so I can get a quick overview of how much effort I might have to invest in researching frequent terms that I might not be familiar with. And it takes me about 1 or 2 minutes to do this. I look through the list quickly and I say, okay, this all looks pretty familiar to me, or, oh, there's some weird terms here that show up a lot. I better talk to the client about this now, because it's Friday and he wants the translation on Monday, and I know he's not available on the weekend. So this is a very, very helpful feature, even if you don't actually use it to build an extra term base. I also actually charge clients for doing terminology work like this, and I create custom glossaries, which very often become value-added additions to my projects. Over the last 18 years doing this with various tools, I've probably, added maybe 40, 50,000 euros to my bottom line, just with information that I'm already gathering in my routine work. So I already have this information, and with a few extra minutes invested, I reformat that in a way that's more appealing and useful for the client, and put it on the bill. Okay, here's an example of the working window for doing term extraction. You can also see in the example that some of the terms already have translations inserted, and these were drawn from some of the term bases that were attached to the project. So using a feature like this, for example, I can see very quickly which terms are already in my term bases, and I can get a feeling for how good the coverage is of the terminology in that particular project. And at the lower right-hand side, there are examples of where those terms occur in both a source and a target language, if it's present. The specific example you see here is a is a hit from a monolingual document. I made a collection of Portuguese laws that are relevant hunting, and there are no translations for these. So there is nothing on the target side, but it shows me an example with the context for this. And you can even add these examples to the term entry and edit it down if you want to. That's a feature that Kilgray also added in the most recent versions of memoQ, I think, starting with 8.3. So just a minute, I'm adding a few people here. Okay, so anyway, that's a very, very useful feature to use. And a couple of other nice things about it is not only can you access the memoQ concordance, your TMs and corpora, to look up specific entries and maybe find possible translations for things in your hit list, but also when you go through and you put in a target translation and you accept the term, those things, if you mark the little checkbox over on the right where it says accepted terms provide lookup results, if you mark that box, then as soon as you have accepted a term, it will show up in your translation results, even if you're not done looking at your list of candidate terms. So in a situation like that, you can get the earliest access possible to what you have identified as useful terminology, even before you write it to Termbase. And that's often a very, very helpful feature. Overall, even though it's missing a few things I like, for example, in SDL multi-term extract, I think that memoQ's term mining features, term extraction features, are probably the best and the most accessible for ordinary people trying to do this kind of work that we've got. And the other advantage of this is that it's free. It's part of what you pay for when you get a memoQ license. You don't have to fork over an extra 500 or 600 euros like you do for SDL multi-term extract, sorry, which also does some weird things like creating terms that don't exist. We won't get into that. memoQ doesn't do anything weird. It just shows you the actual terms. Okay, another nice thing about the memoQ terminology handling is that it prioritizes the term bases according to so-called rankings. And you see examples of that in the screenshot here. You also see something which may be kind of unfamiliar. Next to the name on the right-hand side, you see a QA column. And actually what I'm seeing here in this screenshot is trouble because all of the term bases are marked for use in QA. This is a feature you might not have seen before because it was introduced, I think, in memoQ 8.4, maybe 8.3, I can't remember exactly. But it's extremely useful because in the past, one of the things that's been a real nuisance has been the fact that I always had to unattach term bases that I didn't want to use for quality assurance. And now I can just unmark them here in that column. Okay, when you select a term base, it's marked for QA by default, and I immediately unmark. Okay, but you can also, from your list of term bases, set any one of those term bases in this tab, the term bases tab, as the target for new terms using the icon that I've marked with a red box. However, memoQ is a little bit more powerful than that because here you can only, in the current versions of memoQ, because they haven't updated this feature properly, you can only mark one term base to serve as the target for new terms. However, in reality, when you are using the function for adding a new term, there's a drop-down list at the top where you can set any of the term bases that you have attached to your project as the automatic target for terminology. In this particular case, I have two term bases which are selected. So every time I use the hotkeys to add a term to the term base, either the usual add, which brings up this dialog you see here, or the quick add shortcut, which just writes it quickly to the term base with the defaults and then moves on. So that'll happen automatically in two different term bases every time I hit those default keys. And I could do this to any number. If I had 10 term bases attached, I could automatically write to all 10. I probably wouldn't want to because I have specific term bases for specific purposes. Here, for example, you see I've got a general term base. That's my first one, my master term base. I've got a term base which is specifically for Portuguese hunting. I've got another one which follows that, which is a term base released by one of the legal ministries in the government with their standard terminologies. I've got another one that just relates to language and grammar, and then another one specifically for Portuguese law. So I might want to write specific terms to just one of those term bases and not necessarily one that is written to by default. And for a long time, this was not possible in memoQ until memoQ 2015 came along. And the developers gave us something that many of us have been wishing for since memoQ started to exist. And it's right here. It's in the custom keyboard shortcuts that were introduced as of memoQ 2015. And here you see under the section marked global, a number of different shortcuts that are supposedly available from anywhere within memoQ. And those keyboard assignments that you see here are not defaults. I had to assign those. And if you want to use this feature, you will have to assign them because by default, there are no keyboard shortcuts for those. But you can assign a keyboard shortcut to add specifically to any one of the term bases ranked 1 through 9. And I usually have to make a Post-it note and stick it somewhere on the wall by where I'm working so I can remember what term base ranked number 3 is, whether it's my legal term base or some other term base. So a little extra assistance of Post-it notes or whatever is usually required here, but this is extremely useful. So if I'm in the middle of a legal translation that has to do with hunting or whatever, and all of a sudden I see a medical term, if I've got my medical term base attached and it's all the way down at rank number 8, I just hold down Control-Shift-F8 and it shoots the term straight into that term base. Very, very useful. I don't know any other cat tool today that allows me that degree of control and selectivity for writing entries in a term base. This is, for my work, it's simply wonderful. And I think it's a potential benefit to quite a few other people. Okay, I'm going to talk right now about just some general settings that can improve your experience with term bases. And these are found, the first ones I'm going to talk about are in the term base properties. Now, if people look at this, it's usually maybe to change the name of a term base or maybe to make some adjustments to the meta information, but they don't get past this dialog, this part of dialog. But there's a very useful thing to look at, and it's here under new term defaults at the lower left side of the dialog. And if you click that little blue link there, it will show you this part of the dialog where you are able to set the defaults for 2 different term properties for both your source and your target languages. And that's the matching and the case sensitivity. Now, the right settings to use here are going to depend a lot on the characteristics of the languages that you work with. So the solutions that I think of as being optimal for my work, mostly with German as a source language and English as a target language, might not fit for your languages at all. So I just want to bring this to your attention. And I've got some examples down below that you can look at and consider the relevance of. Just examples of what some of the different match settings mean, for example. And this is an area that is going to be talked about in depth at the workshop in Amsterdam that I talk about in detail in private training workshops or on other occasions. But understanding the optimization of these properties is probably one of the most important things that you can do to improve the quality of your matching and improve your QA results when working with terminology in memoQ. So, and some of it's easy to understand, and some of it is a little subtle and takes some time getting used to. And also, no matter how well you understand these matching properties, case sensitivity properties, you're going to run into documents where what you think of as the best way doesn't fit, and you have to adjust an individual word, or you have to, I'm getting a note that my internet connection is a little bit unstable. I hope it's not causing problems for anyone. But even when you do understand what the different possible settings for matching or case sensitivity or other properties mean, you're always going to have to look at the individual case. And usually that's brought to your attention when you're doing QA and you see a lot of false positives and you try to understand why. And then you have to think about how to adjust the properties for that individual term. Or if you see a consistent pattern, maybe how to adjust the default. You can go in through the properties dialog of any existing memoQ term base and change these defaults anytime you like. Kilgray has, I think, 50% prefix matching for everything for all their term bases by default. So usually I have to go in and make changes, at least so that my source language is set fuzzy. And the reason I do that is because a lot of my clients can't type worth a damn, or I work with a lot of very bad texts that have been put through OCR and not corrected very well. So fuzzy matching makes the source language more fault tolerant. In the translation phase, that's very helpful. Okay, this is an example, again, of my term-based list, but this time I have optimized it so that only one term base will be used in QA. And again, this is only possible with memoQ 8.4 or later, but you know, this is such an incredibly useful thing that this alone is probably worth the bother of upgrading to memoQ 8.4. For my work and my ability to do effective quality control of the terminology, this has been one of the best things that's happened with memoQ in years. Some people said, oh, 8.4 doesn't have anything new and exciting. I beg to differ. This excites me because it saves me a lot of time, and I can see the visible results in the quality of some of the work that I have delivered in recent weeks, because it's just been so much more convenient to check the terminology with only the lists that I have set up checking for terminology. Sometimes the settings on an individual term they use for QA are not the same as the settings that you would want when you're doing the translation part. So anyway, that's something to look forward to in memoQ 8.4. And also, when you're working with quality assurance, it's very useful to save time and avoid dealing with a lot of false positives and long, intimidating lists to create specific lists, specific QA profiles to accomplish specific tasks, like, for example, maybe term-based checks. Okay, and to do, or in some cases, tag checks, because tags are almost everybody's bane. And one of the things that I have done that facilitate this kind of work and make it easy for me to create a custom profile that maybe only checks things that are related to my auto translation rules, for example, which I might use for dates or legal references. I have created a so-called empty QA. Oh, hello. Okay. Anyway, I apologize for the inconvenience here. We had a technical problem. Seems to have gone down. Let me see. I can hear background noise. I'm going to see the screen has changed a little bit here, so I need to make sure that that I can find all the controls. Anyway, things have moved a little bit. Please mute yourselves if you're not muted, because I do hear a little bit of noise in the background. Anyway, sorry for the inconvenience here. This is one of the things I'm getting used to with Zoom. I don't know what happened to the other modem. It was plugged in, but that's technology for you. Anyway, as I was saying, here I've got an example of a list of different QA profiles, including an empty one where all of the individual settings are turned off. So in this particular case, I can go in very quickly to that empty profile, clone it, and select only the features that I would like to check in a particular type of quality assurance check. And that is a big time saver and something that I highly recommend that people learn to do. Okay, and here's an example of the QA profile settings and the ones that are specifically relevant to terminology checking. I've marked those with red stars. You can check source to target, target to source, both ways. Here's the possibility to warn you if a forbidden term is used. And in fact, you could mark that if you just wanted to do a QA check for forbidden terms only, to make sure that certain terms a client said don't use, in fact, were not used. And over on the right-hand side, I've got a check mark by things for auto-translatals, but you can also look for consistency in how terms are formatted in your translation, for example. Okay, and here are some other settings that I'll just go through kind of quickly that are relevant to how terms are used with different aspects from memoQ. Fragment assembly is a feature that most of you are probably familiar with. Those are those purple hits in the translation results list. And here, under the options, which is accessed from the quick access toolbar at the top left of memoQ when it's running, under advanced lookup settings, you have the possibility to tell it whether to use terms or other elements in assembling fragments and suggesting a translation for you. And anyway, but I've marked the parts of this that are relevant to the use of terminology with red stars, just for your easy reference. And some other settings that are relevant to the use of terms while you do your translation work would be found, for example, on the translation ribbon at the far left-hand side under translation settings in the last entry of the drop-down menu, predictive typing and AutoPick. And there are a number of different options for this. Some of you may be familiar with this, but if you aren't, it's definitely worth going there and having a look the next time you're using memoQ, because this can optimize your experience and the value that you get out of your terminology, as well as some other elements. Here are just some examples of the settings, which we don't need to discuss here. Okay, and there's a lot of different options here, so it's worth spending a little bit of time getting familiar with some of this. We may be touching on this if we've got enough time at the workshop in Amsterdam. Okay, one of the most critical parts of working with terminology in memoQ, and a big area of emphasis for me whenever I teach people how to optimize their terminology and get the best matching results during translation, get the best, most accurate error flagging when they run a QA check, is to understand term entry properties. I'm going to give just a superficial overview of that here today. But this is something that I return to time and again in other presentations. And this is absolutely worth investing some time in and going back and reviewing from time to time, because I have often found, as I've encountered new types of terms or different problems that have been flagged in quality assurance, or things that my customer may point out that I missed in my QA checks, I often find that the answers can be found by going back and looking very carefully at the property settings and the terminology and how to optimize these. And if you see the dialog that looks like this, notice that at the bottom, there's a little things called more, which will show you more properties that may be of interest for you to optimize. Just a minute. Okay, that would also relate to the metadata, for example, which you can adjust for individual terms. Okay, and there are a lot of other features down here that may be of interest to you, including the ability to add images. And here's a look at the memoQ term editor, which has that same property information down at the bottom of it. This is the view that you're going to get of your terminology if you are in the resource console or in the Termbase tab of an individual project, and you choose to edit a Termbase. It will present the Termbase content to you in a window that looks like this, with all the term properties down at the bottom, with both tabs of the dialog displayed at the same time. One thing I'll point out here that might be useful to know, if you find that you've been making a lot of term entries that don't have the settings that serve you best, let's say you've got 2,000 entries that are all 50% prefix, and most of the time it shouldn't be 50% prefix, maybe you'd prefer it to be fuzzy. One of the things that you can do when you are looking at your terminology in this view is you can do multiple selections by clicking on one of the entries. In this case, number 5 has been selected. And if I hold down my shift key and I click, say, on number 10, for example, 5 through 10 will be selected. Or if I hold down the control key on my keyboard and I click on number 1 and number 9 and number 12, then I'll have 4 entries selected. You can select the entire Termbase that way if you want. And when you've done that, if you go to the bottom of this window and you change a particular property, like the matching, and you change it to fuzzy, then every one of those entries that you have selected will be changed to fuzzy matching. All the other properties that you're not changing will be left alone. But you could go and change some other property, like the case sensitivity, for example. And this way, I often go through my term bases and I look for where I've got acronyms. Here you see in this example, in the screenshot, a number of acronyms. Those typically benefit from having exact matching set, whereas I don't want to do exact matching for most of my other terms. So I would go through and hold down my control key and click on several different entries and then set it exact matching. And then I've corrected that property for all of the terms that I've selected. This is something that, as far as I know, is not documented anywhere in any manual from Kilgray. I hope I'm wrong, but I haven't seen it anywhere before. I think I've mentioned it in a couple of blog posts. I mention it in talks from time to time. But sometimes people ask me, what can I do? I've got this big term base and the properties are all messed up. They're not the way I want them. And, well, the answer is fairly simple. Go into the Termbase editor, select the range of what you want, and change it to what you want. And if you've got 5,000 terms and most of them need to be fuzzy, okay, fine. Then change all 5,000 to fuzzy at once, and then go find the 25 terms that need to be exact or something else and adjust those. But this gives you some options of working a little bit more quickly to upgrade properties. I do this sometimes with term exports from a translation term base that I'm going to bring into a QA term base, where I might want to change the settings for QA purposes to something very different than I use for translation. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind, and it can be very, very helpful when you work with terminology. Okay, I mentioned this before. This slide's actually kind of out of place. memoQ terms can include graphics, and here's a screenshot example of that. In fact, you can bring the graphic up by clicking on the little, looks like a film film clip icon to the left of the pencil icon in the kind of bluish gray bar. It brings up that image window. And those can also be animated GIFs, for example. So, for example, some of my engineering entries might have little animations that show how a part works. If it's something that I'm having a hard time getting my head around, that's a very useful thing sometimes. And this has been a feature of memoQ for a very long time. I don't even remember when they put it in. It's like version 4, maybe even before. It's been around forever. But one of the problems that I've always had making use of this particular feature is that when I try to export the terms and import them somewhere else, the images didn't come along. Now, mind you, I don't use images in most of my term bases. I don't need to. But sometimes, for example, if I'm doing some sort of a natural history or nature conservation related translation, and I've got several different types of snakes that all kind of look alike or whatever, as an old herpetologist, I like to see the pictures of the snakes so I can be sure what I'm talking about. Again, in some of my patent translations, sometimes it helps to have the picture of the particular part available to look at if I need to, because sometimes I have to look for very specific features on that picture to be sure of a term that I'm using to describe it. So anyway, as of memoQ 8.4, this useful feature has now become so much more useful, because now you can share not only the term entries themselves, but any graphics that you've associated with that. Again, there are so many different aspects of memoQ term properties and how these can benefit you for your translation work and for your QA. You could make a full-day workshop just on that subject. But even 10 minutes invested in reading up on this in the memoQ help, or looking at some examples on my blog, or discussing that with other users, or even just going through and testing different properties and read up on them in the help, test it out and see how it works, you will see some benefits from that. This is, I think, one of the low-hanging fruits on the memoQ tree, and definitely worth taking a bite of. And anyway, this brings us to the end of the talk for today, and I'm going to open it up for Q&A in a second. This software, memoQ, and any other translation software that we use to support our work, is kind of like an electronic donkey. And you're the rider, okay? Don't be an ass. Stay in the saddle. Learn how to control your environment, your working tools, and in particular, terminology. And you're going to get a lot of value out of this in your translation and your quality assurance work. And also, the things I've talked about today apply just as well to editing work in memoQ, which is part of the translation and QA process, of course. Anyway, I thank everybody for your attention today. And I'm not sure how to bring up the chat dialog again. So crossing my fingers and hoping that with the number of participants, it won't result in much chaos. If you have a question, just feel free to activate the microphone and ask. If you've typed it in the chat box, I apologize. I can't find the chat box right now, but you're welcome to repeat your question now. Any questions? Okay. If nobody does have questions, you're also welcome to follow up with any questions related to this material. If you try to apply it later and you find that you've forgotten some of it or whatever, you are welcome to contact me via Facebook, via email. I'm having some problems with my main email account, which I'm trying to resolve with the provider right now. They changed the servers recently, and their instructions for migrating aren't working. So if I'm not responding to your email, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because of a technical problem. But anyway, I will be more than happy to answer these questions. There will also be a copy of this presentation posted as a file on YouTube, so you can go back and look at it later or share it with other people who were not able to join us today. Thank you, everybody, very much, and hope to see you again at a future date. I've got another presentation like this. Here's the chat box. Just a minute. I have a few people. Okay. Yeah, if any of you would like a copy of the MP4 file from this to use for internal training purposes or just for local reference or whatever, just contact me privately. And as long as you're not going to be selling it to somebody or whatever, I'm perfectly okay with people using this for their own learning purposes. I mean, that's the whole point. We share information, we learn, and we grow together. But anyway, thank you all so much, and I will make the information on where to find this video and possibly some other resources available through Facebook. I will post it on my blog, probably as an update to the original announcement for this workshop. Oh, by the way, on June 21st, which is another Thursday afternoon at the same time, 3 o'clock Lisbon time, 4 p.m. Central European time, and whatever time that is in the various time zones of the US and elsewhere, I will be doing a workshop on a tool called Iceni Infix for working with PDFs. And there's a lot of very useful things you can do with that particular tool to make PDF work a lot more useful, a lot easier, a lot more trouble-free. And that can be done with, some of it can be done, a lot of it can be done with unlicensed versions, so for free for anybody. And in some cases, it may be worth thinking about paying for a license for some of the more advanced features that I'll be talking about. Over the years, this has turned out to be one of the most useful auxiliary tools in my toolkit. And there's a lot more to Iceni than TransPDX, you may know, in memoQ, which some people freak out because of confidentiality reasons, but there are ways around that using other features, and there's a lot more. So if you're interested in that, have a look on my blog. There's a link to the sign up for that June workshop, and then there will be others to follow. I'm going to try to do this about once a month because the Zoom license makes it very easy and convenient to do presentations like this and share things and talk about problem areas that people ask me about a lot, and hopefully create a resource that becomes easier to share with other people. One last thing that I want to leave you with, this will be posted on my blog soon, but for those of you who like to travel or who are in Portugal already, in the summer at Universidade Nova de Lisboa, a new university of Lisbon, there will be 3 different summer classes with 25 hours of instruction each. One is in memoQ Basics. That'll be starting, I think, on July 9th and go from Monday to Saturday. During the regular work week, it'll be offered as an evening course from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. And then there's a Saturday morning session for review and exams. Then there's a best practices course following after that. And then later in early September, there will be a course on some project management skills that's going to talk a lot about memoQ server or just general preparation skills that you might need when managing projects as an agency PM or just as a team leader, maybe working with a memoQ server or working with the project manager version of memoQ or in other configurations. All of that information will be posted on my Translation Tribulations blog. It'll also be discussed in various forums of Facebook. These summer courses, I'll be co-teaching 2 of them. They'll also be taught with colleagues David Hardesty and Marco Neves, whom you may know. David, for example, has been one of the leaders in doing some really, really innovative work with speech recognition. And there's going to be some of that in the best practices class. Maybe the memoQ Basics, I don't know. Actually considering some things that are coming up that I can't talk about, probably the memoQ Basics too. But anyway, definitely worth your time. And Marco has got a lot of varied experience as a translation company owner, and he knows a lot about the memoQ server and different aspects. So it's a great team. I love working with these guys, and I think for people from outside the country who aren't students or whatever, I think that 25 hours of which is only 130 bloody euros, that's nothing. So you can come enjoy Portuguese beaches and cuisine during the daytime and relax. And then in the evening, if you're still awake, come to class and learn a lot, ask questions and have more fun. Anyway, again, thank you, everybody. And I will edit up the pieces of this presentation, join the split where the router failed, and try to make this all available to you without much delay. All of you have a good evening. I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.